Hey there, honors biologists. This video is just a quick introduction to our new unit, Unit 8, Protein Synthesis. You might wonder why we are going from DNA to proteins or why are proteins so important to talk about as an entire unit in this class. But what we're going to be learning about is essentially how proteins are essential for life and how they are coded for by our DNA. Remember how we talked about how DNA is the genetic instruction manual and how it determines how all cells function? Well, it does that by creating the proteins that do the jobs that control how cells function. And all of the information that makes you unique, all of the things that produce your traits and physical characteristics are produced by proteins. So in this unit, we are going to be learning about how our instruction manual encoded by the molecule DNA is used to produce a temporary copy of small sections of that genetic code. You might have heard of the word gene, for example, and how a gene is a small section of DNA that codes for a specific trait. So we'll be learning about how DNA makes a small temporary copy of each gene in the form of RNA, and then how RNA is used and translated into the structure of a protein, which then performs its function. Let's talk about some examples of different types of proteins and things they do. We've already learned a lot about enzymes and how enzymes are types of proteins that catalyze chemical reactions, which means it makes them go faster, it reduces the energy required. Some examples of enzymes are like, for example, the one that helps fireflies glow at night. So enzymes do lots of different jobs. Structural proteins are those that provide strength and stability and support for not only your cells, but also your entire body. Some proteins specialize in sending signals. For example, the adrenaline response is controlled by proteins. So if you are startled by something and you're surprised and you need to do a fight or flight response, that is initiated by proteins that travel through your entire bloodstream, activating different organs and telling them to start reacting. Regulatory proteins we've learned about, even though you might struggle with the context of what is a regulatory protein. Remember when we talked about cancer and the cell cycle and how when a cell is cancerous, we hope that it undergoes apoptosis or self-destruction. Well, that process is controlled and managed by proteins. Transport proteins are those that are involved in transporting molecules or transporting structures. For example, when you think about the transport of oxygen around your body or carbon dioxide, when we talked about proteins and protein channels in cells and cell transport, that's another example. Some proteins are entirely used to detect sense. For example, opsins are types of proteins in your eye and they detect light. Olfactory receptors sense and detect airborne chemicals, so on and so forth. So that's another example of proteins. Motor proteins are those that, when you think about the word motor, it helps move. So these are proteins that help move your muscles and your muscle cells in particular, which then therefore moves entire muscle tissue. Defense proteins, these are kind of cool. So some examples are the types of antibodies that course through your bloodstream and they attack the bacteria and viruses that make you sick. Fibrin proteins from blood clots and scabs at a wound site prevent you from bleeding out. And some organisms create or produce proteins that make them taste toxic to organisms or are toxic. And so plants will create these proteins to prevent insects from consuming them. And last but not least, storage proteins. These are proteins that specialize in storing information or molecules. So when we think about life, all of life is dependent on all of these proteins. So what we're going to be learning about in the first couple of days is something called the central dogma of biology, which means the central set of rules that governs life. And that is this overview of process from DNA to a temporary copy of parts of it in the form of RNA, and then creating that final protein. So you are going to be doing the central dogma of biology Explo for the first 2 to 3 days, and then you'll also be doing some notes. So remember that the Explo activities are meant to be exploratory, meaning you might not be given all of the answers. You need to use your critical thinking skills, your background knowledge, and your skills of observation and deduction in order to answer the questions. The first part of this Explo has you review some of the most relevant review that you've learned over the past few units that has to do with priming you and getting you ready for understanding what we'll be talking about in this unit. So I gave you information about the units that this content comes from if you needed those clues or some help. I also provided some little diagrams here that might provide some clues or jumpstart your memory. And then the rest of the questions can be answered simply by careful analysis of the little text and or the diagrams. Just read the text and the diagrams carefully, and you should be able to answer the questions. I also encourage you to work on this collaboratively. If you have a friend who's in honors biology, maybe set up a time during class time or outside of class time where you can work on this for a little bit together. For my students in periods 1 through 4, you're going to be working on this during our Zoom class on Monday. And for period 7, we were going to be finishing it together during our 7th period class on Tuesday. But you will be expected to do parts of it outside of class. And you should try to get both your notes, well, I shouldn't say you should try, you need to have both your notes and the entire Central Dogma of Biology Explo completed by Wednesday night. Because remember that Monday and Tuesday assignments are accepted for full credit if turned in by Wednesday night. So make sure you're keeping up with the work, and then send me messages if you have questions. Thanks for watching. I hope this was a helpful introduction, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.